If you belong to Generation X, you were never told you were special. No one built a narrative around your importance. No one described you as the future, the hope, or the center of cultural attention.
You were simply expected to manage, to adapt, to figure things out alone.
And that psychological environment left a deeper imprint than most people realize.
From a Jungian perspective, Generation X did not just grow up during a historical transition.
They developed within a specific emotional climate, one defined by absence, early independence, and the quiet pressure to become self-sufficient long before emotional maturity was fully formed. Carl Jung believed that the personality is shaped not only by personal experience, but by the emotional atmosphere surrounding development. For many Gen X women, childhood was marked by the phenomenon of the empty house, the latchkey years, coming home to silence, learning to regulate fear, boredom, and uncertainty without guidance.
This experience created something powerful, but also complex,
an early shadow self. When a child learns that emotional needs cannot be consistently met, the psyche adapts. Vulnerability is pushed underground. Dependency is hidden. Fear is managed privately. On the surface, independence develops quickly. But underneath, the unexpressed needs do not disappear. They become part of the shadow.
This is why many Gen X women appear strong, capable, and emotionally self-contained.
They learned early that survival meant handling things alone. But Jung would say that strength formed under emotional scarcity always carries an unconscious cost.
The shadow of Gen X is not weakness, it is unmet tenderness.
This early adaptation also shaped the persona, the social mask Jung described as the face we present to the world. For Generation X, that mask often took the form of realism, irony, emotional restraint, and quiet skepticism. Hope felt naive. Idealism felt dangerous. Better to expect less and manage disappointment than to trust and be let down. This is what psychologists sometimes call defensive realism, but Jung would recognize it as a protective persona designed to prevent further emotional exposure. Gen X learned not to ask for too much, not to need too much, not to expect too much. And this psychological posture worked for decades. It created competence, resilience, self-reliance, the ability to navigate chaos without panic. But as Jung repeatedly emphasized, what helps us survive early life does not always help us grow later. Midlife is where the unconscious begins to speak. If you're part of this generation and this feels familiar, the strength, the independence, the quiet emotional distance, pause for a moment. Subscribe to Inner Wise Woman and write love in the comments. This space is for women who learned to survive early and are now learning to live more consciously. Because the real psychological story of Generation X is not about survival anymore. It is about individuation. The strength that once protected you can become isolation. The independence that once empowered you can become emotional distance. The realism that once grounded you can slowly turn into cynicism. Jung warned that when the persona becomes too rigid, the psyche begins to compensate. The shadow pushes forward. Old emotions surface. A sense of emptiness appears where competence once felt sufficient.
This is not failure. This is the psyche asking for balance.
As Generation X moved from childhood into adulthood, the early need for self-protection did not disappear. It evolved. What began as emotional independence slowly became a psychological posture, one that Jung would recognize as the activation of a powerful archetype, the Senex. The Senex, or the old man archetype, represents wisdom, structure, realism, and restraint. At its best, it brings stability, discernment, and the ability to see through illusion. But when it develops too early, before the emotional life is fully matured, it can harden into something else. Guardedness, cynicism, emotional distance, and a quiet mistrust of hope. Many Gen X women became old souls long before their time. They learned not to expect rescue, not to believe in grand promises, not to rely too much on others. This early Senex energy created competence and emotional control, but it also suppressed the opposite archetypal force, the poor, or the inner child, the part of the psyche that carries spontaneity, emotional openness, curiosity, and the capacity for joy without irony. Jung believed that psychological health depends on balance between these forces. Structure needs play. Realism needs imagination. Self-reliance needs the ability to receive. But for many in Generation X, the Senex became dominant while the puer retreated into the shadow. This imbalance shaped an entire emotional style. You learn to manage expectations instead of dreaming, to stay composed instead of expressing, to anticipate disappointment instead of trusting possibility. Culturally, this appeared as irony, detachment, and emotional understatement. Humor became defensive, vulnerability felt uncomfortable. Enthusiasm seemed naive. Better to stay grounded than risk emotional exposure. And again, this strategy worked. It allowed Gen X to navigate economic uncertainty, family instability, cultural shifts, and rapid technological change without collapsing. But Jung warned that when one archetype dominates for too long, the psyche eventually demands compensation. That compensation often begins in midlife. This is where many Gen X women now find themselves, feeling restless without understanding why. From the outside, life may look stable, career established, responsibilities managed, independence intact. But internally, something feels incomplete. The emotional range feels narrower than it once was. Joy feels muted. Connection feels effortful. This is not burnout alone. This is archetypal imbalance. The suppressed puer, the spontaneous feeling hopeful part of the psyche, begins to push forward. You may suddenly crave creativity, emotional depth, new experiences, or a different pace of life. You may feel tired of carrying everything alone. You may notice a longing for warmth, meaning, or emotional presence that was previously ignored. Jung described this as the beginning of the midlife transition, the moment when the psyche shifts from survival to integration. For Generation X, this transition can feel especially confusing because your identity was built around competence and control. Letting go of constant self-sufficiency can feel like weakness. Expressing need can feel unnatural. Softening the defensive realism that protected you for decades can feel risky. But this softening is not regression, it is individuation beginning. The psyche is asking you to reclaim the parts of yourself that were postponed, the emotional openness that once felt unsafe, the curiosity that once seemed impractical, the desire for connection that independence kept at a distance. This is the deeper psychological story of Generation X, not the generation that became cynical, but the generation that learned realism too early and is now being asked to rediscover emotional range. For Generation X, midlife is not simply a period of adjustment. Psychologically, it is the moment when the structure that carried you for decades begins to feel too narrow for the person you have become. Jung described midlife not as decline, but as the turning point where the psyche shifts its center of gravity from outer achievement and stability toward inner meaning and wholeness. For many Gen X women, this transition arrives quietly, without dramatic events, yet with a persistent inner signal that something is changing. What once felt sufficient, competence, independence, control, the ability to handle everything alone, no longer brings the same sense of fulfillment. You may notice a subtle fatigue with constant self-reliance, a growing impatience with purely practical living, or a longing for emotional depth that you previously learned to live without. This is not dissatisfaction with your life. It is dissatisfaction with survival mode. Jung believed that the first half of life is structured around adaptation. We build identity through roles, responsibilities, productivity, and external stability. Generation X did this exceptionally well. You became reliable, capable, efficient, and emotionally contained. But the second half of life asks a different question. Not how well you function, but how fully you live. And this is where the shadow begins to speak again. The tenderness that was suppressed, the vulnerability that was postponed, the emotional needs that independence kept hidden. These elements begin to surface, not to disrupt your life, but to expand it. Yet for Gen X, this expansion often feels uncomfortable because it requires loosening the psychological armor that once ensured survival. Many women at this stage experience a quiet identity tension. On the outside, you are strong, stable, and self-sufficient. On the inside, you may feel a growing desire for warmth, authenticity, creativity, intimacy, or simply the freedom to stop being the one who holds everything together. Jung called this the movement toward the self, the deeper center of the psyche that seeks balance between strength and softness, structure and feeling, independence and connection. But here is where the resistance appears, because the persona of Generation X is built on resilience. Asking for emotional space can feel uncomfortable. Slowing down can feel unproductive. Admitting emotional needs can feel unfamiliar. The inner voice may even question the legitimacy of these longings. You've handled everything so far. Why change now? The answer is simple, because what helped you survive the first half of life cannot sustain the second. Midlife, in Jungian terms, is not a crisis of failure. It is a crisis of meaning. The psyche begins to withdraw energy from roles, achievements, and external validation, and redirect it inward. You may feel less motivated by status, less impressed by productivity, less interested in proving your competence. Instead, you become more sensitive to authenticity, emotional truth, and the quality of your inner life. This shift can feel disorienting in a culture that still rewards performance over presence. But psychologically, it is a sign of health. If you are feeling this transition, the quiet pull away from constant functioning and towards something deeper, subscribe to Inner Wise Woman. This space is for women who are moving beyond survival and learning to live with awareness, depth, and emotional wholeness. Because what is happening now is not a loss of strength. It is the beginning of integration. And when integration begins, the final challenge emerges: how to live in a world that has become increasingly fast, digital, and disconnected, while your psyche is asking for something slower, more real, and more human. Generation X stands in a unique psychological position that no other generation has experienced in quite the same way. You were formed in an analog emotional world where time moved slower, interactions were physical, silence existed, and identity developed without constant digital exposure. And yet, you now live inside a hyper-connected environment that demands speed, visibility, and continuous adaptation. Jung would recognize this tension immediately. The psyche develops according to the emotional rhythm of early life, and for Gen X, that rhythm was slower, more private, and more internally oriented. But the modern digital world operates on the opposite principle. Constant stimulation, external validation, comparison, and the pressure to remain visible and responsive at all times. This creates what can be called the digital paradox. Outwardly, Generation X has adapted remarkably well. You learned the technology, navigated the transitions, stayed productive, and remained competent. But inwardly, many Gen X women feel a subtle but persistent fatigue, a sense that the world has become too loud, too fast, too performative. This is not resistance to change. It is a mismatch between psychological wiring and cultural speed. Jung believed that individuation requires periods of reflection, silence, and inner dialogue. The self emerges slowly. It cannot be rushed, optimized, or managed through constant stimulation. But modern life leaves very little psychological space for that process. For Gen X, the challenge of midlife individuation is not only internal, it is environmental. You are trying to move toward depth in a culture that rewards distraction. You are trying to become more authentic in a system built on presentation. You are trying to slow down internally while everything around you accelerates. And this is why many Gen X women feel drawn toward simplicity, privacy, and emotional selectivity. You may find yourself withdrawing from unnecessary noise, limiting social exposure, questioning digital habits, or choosing fewer but deeper connections. This is not disengagement. It is psychological self-protection. Jung would say the psyche naturally moves toward conditions that support wholeness. When external environments become overwhelming, the inner world begins to reclaim its boundaries. This is the final phase of the Gen X psychological journey, moving from adaptation to alignment. You are no longer trying to keep up with every change. You are choosing what actually supports your inner life. You are no longer measuring value through visibility. You are measuring it through depth, meaning, and emotional truth. This is why Generation X is not the forgotten generation. It is the transitional generation, the bridge between speed and depth, between analog presence and digital complexity, between survival and individuation. And for women especially, this stage holds extraordinary potential. The strength you developed early, the realism that protected you, and the independence that carried you through uncertainty now become assets for the second half of life. Because individuation requires exactly what you already possess: resilience, self-awareness, and the ability to stand alone long enough to become whole. If this perspective speaks to your experience, subscribe to Inner Wise Woman. This space is for women who are not trying to become louder, faster, or more visible, but deeper, calmer, and more aligned. The real psychological story of Generation X is not about being overlooked. It is about becoming inwardly powerful in a world that moves too quickly to notice depth. And that quiet strength may become this generation's greatest legacy.